Hello and welcome to BYJU'S. Last week, India and US have held their first ever 2+2 dialogue. A number of important agreements were signed. Both the sides have discussed global and regional issues of mutual concern. And after the Indo-US nuclear deal of 2005, this 2+2 dialogue is being labeled as the next biggest development in Indo-US bilateral relations. Since 2005, India has strategically aligned itself with the United States. The relationship between the two countries has been blooming over the last decade. The economic relationship is on the upswing, and the US has emerged as one of India's largest defense trading partners. And we have witnessed a greater convergence between the two in the areas of defense and security. But despite these significant developments in the relationship, there are a few reasons for India to be cautious. There are still many issues where India and the US are not exactly on the same page. There are concerns that are held by the Indian government when it comes to its relations with the US, which can affect India's foreign policy choices. So in this context, let us evaluate the developments of the 2+2 dialogue and analyze the impact of the summit on Indian foreign policy in general and India's bilateral relations with the US in particular. First, let us understand what is a 2+2 dialogue. A 2+2 engagement between two countries is basically a dialogue format wherein the External Affairs Minister and the Defense Minister of India interact with their respective counterparts. In case of India and US, the interaction is between the Defense Minister and the Foreign Minister of India and the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State of the United States. So such a high-level diplomatic engagement between the defense and foreign ministries of both the sides is labeled as a 2+2 dialogue. In such a dialogue, the focus is entirely on defense and foreign policy issues which are affecting both the sides, and issues of strategic and geopolitical significance are discussed amongst the four ministers. India already has a similar engagement with Japan. We have a 2+2 format with Japan where the defense and foreign secretaries of both the sides, they interact to discuss crucial issues of defense and security. And the 2+2 engagement between India and US was actually pending from a very long time. It was supposed to be held in 2017 itself. But due to certain issues between India and US, due to certain conflicts between the two sides, the summit was postponed multiple times. It was also being said that India-US relationship had hit a roadblock because of various economic and security challenges. After multiple postponements, the two sides have reached a middle ground and they have recently held the first ever 2+2 dialogue. Now let us summarize the crucial outcomes of the 2+2 dialogue and then we shall discuss these outcomes in detail. At the end of the 2+2 summit, India has signed the historic COMCASA agreement. We shall talk about the details of the agreement, why it is significant for India, and what could be the implications of India signing this foundational agreement. Second, both the sides have agreed to create a hotline arrangement between the External Affairs Minister of India and the Secretary of State of the United States, and as well as a hotline facility will be set up between the Defense Minister of India and the Secretary of Defense of the United States. This hotline arrangement will provide for direct engagement between the ministers. It will help in greater coordination between the two governments, and that too at the highest levels of the political leadership. And then both the sides have agreed to conduct a tri-services joint military exercise which will commence from next year, that is in 2019. India and US already have a very close defense relationship. We already conduct joint military exercises with the respective armies, navies, and the Air Force. We already have the Malabar exercise between the two navies, and then we have Yudh Abhyas, which is a joint exercise between the two armies. The Indian Air Force and the US Air Force also conduct frequent joint exercises, but these are standalone exercises between the respective forces. But under this agreement, from 2019, India and US will conduct tri-services joint military exercise, wherein all the three armed forces will set up a joint tri-services command, and they will try to establish interoperability with their American counterparts. Such a tri-services exercise will definitely help India to fine-tune its war-fighting capabilities, and it will also promote greater coordination with the American forces. Another agreement was signed between the Indian Navy and the US Naval Forces Central Command. This agreement between the US NavCent and the Indian Navy will provide for better maritime cooperation between the two navies. It will provide for intelligence sharing. It will provide for domain awareness for the two navies, which have very important stakes in the Indo-Pacific region. Apart from these agreements, India and US have reportedly discussed the increasing Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific region, especially the South China Sea conflict. Both the sides have also discussed China's aggressive strategy in the Indian Ocean region, and they are looking at establishing a rules-based order for the Indo-Pacific region. This is designed as a counter to China's aggression in the Indian Ocean and as well as in the South China Sea. Then India has also brought up a couple of concerns that it has with regard to US foreign policy. India has discussed the impact of sanctions on Russia and Iran with regard to our defense and oil imports from the respective countries. India also has brought up the trade disputes with the United States. And finally, India has sought greater support from the US for its entry into the Nuclear Suppliers Group, or also called as the NSG. So these are some of the key developments which took place at the Indo-US-2+2 dialogue. Now we shall talk about these developments in detail and evaluate its impact on India's foreign policy. First, let's talk about the COMCASA. COMCASA stands for Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement. India has signed this crucial agreement, and this is one of the 4 foundational agreements that the US expects its defense partners to sign with the American government. If a country is looking for closer defense engagement with the US, then the American government will expect that the other country should sign the 4 foundational agreements. In fact, all the NATO allies have already signed the 4 foundational agreements, and there are non-NATO countries as well, such as Brazil and UAE, which have signed the 4 foundational agreements because they import US weapons and defense platforms. And since India's import of US weapons is increasing day by day, and since we have a very close defense trading relationship, the US is expecting that India will sign these 4 foundational agreements. And COMCASA is one of the 4 foundational agreements. Now let us talk about the 4 foundational agreements. Let's see what they are. First, we have the General Security of Military Information Agreement. It basically provides for better exchange of military information between the 2 armed forces. This obviously includes intelligence sharing as well. And India has signed this agreement in 2002 itself. Second, we have the Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, or LEMOA, which was signed by India in 2016. This agreement provides for exchange of logistic facilities between the 2 sides. For example, India will provide refueling facilities for a US naval ship. Maybe US will provide mid-air refueling facilities for Indian aircraft in some other part of the world. So logistics between the two armed forces will be exchanged as a part of this agreement. The third agreement is Communications and Information Security Memorandum of Agreement, or abbreviated as CISMOA. And the COMCASA agreement that India has signed is nothing but another version of CISMOA. Even though the details of this agreement is not available in the public domain because it is a classified agreement, it's widely reported that COMCASA is just another version of the CISMOA agreement. It essentially provides for exchange of advanced communication technology and as well as security of information which is shared between the two sides. So this agreement was signed at the 2+2 dialogue between India and US. Then we have the fourth one, which is Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement, or BECA, for Geospatial Intelligence. This agreement will provide for exchange of geospatial data, intelligence collected through GIS resources, geospatial resources, will be shared between the two sides. And this is the only agreement which India is yet to sign out of the 4 foundational agreements. If a country is seeking closer strategic alignment with the US, then the US government will expect that the country should sign these 4 foundational agreements. Only then US will share advanced defense technology with the country. Only then US will provide for greater alignment in the defense and security domain. But the signing of these foundational agreements has always been a controversial topic in India, because these agreements, once they are signed, it imposes a certain obligation on the government of India. It can actually expose India's vulnerability to the United States as well. There are possibilities where India's national interests can be compromised by signing these agreements. There have been concerns expressed by strategic thinkers that India might compromise its policy of strategic autonomy by signing the 4 foundational agreements with the US. Because this will essentially turn India into an ally of the United States. And if you evaluate India's foreign policy since independence, India has resisted attempts to side itself with any power bloc. It has always tried to remain independent. It has followed a policy of strategic autonomy, and it is guided by its own national interests as compared to the interests of another powerful country. So there are concerns being expressed that India might compromise these policies, these time-tested policies, by signing the 4 foundational agreements with the United States. But on the plus side, India will receive advanced defense technology from the US. It will help India to ramp up its defense capabilities and will bring greater alignment between India and US with regard to strategic policy choices. By signing the COMCASA, India will be eligible to access encrypted American communication technology. These are advanced communication technologies which are possessed by the US armed forces, and these communication technologies or data links which are developed by the US defense forces, they are considered to be one of the most secure and advanced communication technology available. And these data links are already installed on most defense platforms that the US is exporting. See, India already has imported a number of defense platforms from the United States. This includes the C-17 Globemaster, which is a strategic heavy lift aircraft. Then we have imported the C-130J Super Hercules, which is largely used for special operations. Then India also has imported the P-8I aircraft, and the P-8I aircraft is used in anti-submarine warfare. So these 3 are critical platforms that India has already inducted into its armed forces. But unfortunately, since we had not signed the CISMOA or the COMCASA agreement, these platforms did not contain the advanced encrypted communication data links that the US armed forces have developed. Indian armed forces have been using commercially available communication technology. On these platforms in particular, India has been using commercially available technology. So this makes our defense communication very vulnerable to interception and data leakage. If these platforms are provided with US data links, which are highly encrypted, which are secure, it will definitely enhance the potency of these platforms. So if India can access US data links, it will be a huge boost for India's defense capabilities. It will enhance our preparedness. It will provide India with better situational awareness, especially in the Indian Ocean region, that is in the IOR region, a region where China has increased its activities in the recent years. China has started pushing its naval vessels and even submarines into the Indian Ocean, and India considers this as a major national security threat. So by having access to advanced communication equipment from the US, Indian platforms such as C-17, P-8I and C-130J, they will be able to provide better situational awareness for India in the Indian Ocean region. It will help us to understand the domain and monitor the region very effectively. Along with these advantages, the signing of COMCASA will also help in enhancing the interoperability between the two forces. If Indian and US forces are using the same communication equipment, then definitely it will increase coordination and communication between the two forces, especially when joint military exercises are being conducted. India and US also engage in disaster management exercises in the Indian Ocean region. So during such exercises, be it military exercises or disaster management exercises, by having the same communication equipment, it will boost interoperability between the two forces. But there are a few concerns for India with regard to the COMCASA agreement. India has already shared its concerns with the US. One of the concerns is with regard to information security. How secure would Indian communication be on US communication platforms? And India is also concerned about the sharing of this information by US with other countries which have signed the 4 foundational agreements. For example, other countries which operate US defense platforms, and if they have signed COMCASA, even they will be eligible for accessing the information which is shared on these communication equipment. So India is worried that its sensitive defense communication can end up being shared by the United States with other countries belonging to NATO and as well as the non-NATO powers. India is especially worried that the US might share the information with Pakistan as well, which is a close defense partner for the United States. And since India and US have a long history of mistrust, India is concerned that the US might use the COMCASA agreement as a leverage during times of war and conflict, because the Indian defense forces, which rely on US communication equipment, will be at the mercy of the US government. And it is being reported that the US government has assured India that its concerns will be taken care of, that the information security of India's defense platforms will be kept secure. The US has assured India that information will not be shared with other countries without India's prior consent. So based on these promises, India has felt confident to sign the COMCASA agreement, and we have signed the foundational agreement which will enable India to access advanced encrypted communication technology from the United States. Apart from signing these landmark agreements, India and US have also discussed a few strategic issues which have global and regional ramifications. One such issue is the rising aggression of China in the Indo-Pacific region. I'm sure most of you are aware about the South China Sea conflict, where China is being very aggressive with a number of Southeast Asian countries. This is to do with the maritime boundary dispute between China and a few other Southeast Asian countries. China has adopted a very aggressive posture. It has threatened freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and these developments are a cause of alarm for both India and the United States. Because South China Sea is a crucial link between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Very large volumes of trade passes through the South China Sea region, and any hostility in the South China Sea will definitely have an economic impact on India and the United States. So both the countries have a common position with regard to China's aggression here. India and US have expressed open support to the fundamental right of freedom to navigation. They have called upon China to resolve the conflict through negotiations and through peaceful methods. And both countries have been closely watching the increasing presence of Chinese naval forces in the Indian Ocean region. Under its One Belt, One Road initiative, and as well as under the so-called string of pearls theory, China has managed to increase its strategic relations with a number of countries in the Indian Ocean region. This includes China's strategic ties with Myanmar, with Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka, with Maldives in particular, Mauritius, Seychelles, and even the East African countries. China has invested in multiple port facilities in this region. It has even deployed naval assets, including naval vessels and nuclear submarines. It has had a very strong presence in the Gulf of Aden region to counter piracy in the Indian Ocean. And China recently has set up a naval base in the African country of Djibouti. So all these developments are of great concern for India because India considers the Indian Ocean as its strategic backyard. The US also has a very strong presence in the Indian Ocean. It has historically dominated the Pacific Ocean as well. And it is very much interested in countering Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific region. This is where we should talk about the proposed grouping known as the Quad or the Quadrilateral. This is a proposed grouping of India, US, Japan, and Australia. 4 large democracies with similar strategic ambitions and with similar concerns in the Indian Ocean region. So this grouping has come together informally and it is being labeled as a power bloc which can counter China's aggression. Under the quadrilateral grouping, the United States is pushing for a rules-based order for the Indo-Pacific region, where every country has to abide by the laid out international rules. It has to abide by the international law which is in place. This will ensure that China will reduce its aggression and follow international practices when it comes to resolving maritime boundary disputes. India also has expressed open support to the objective of establishing a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. But apart from this, India has a few concerns about the proposed idea of a Quad. Even though India has participated informally in this arrangement, it is still concerned that the grouping might acquire a military angle because India would be hesitant to join any military power bloc which is designed to counter a powerful neighbor such as China. India and China already have enough border disputes. We already have a strategic competition going on across the world. So India would not like to complicate things with China unnecessarily. So at the 2+2 dialogue, India and US have conducted deliberations on this regard. They have spoken about the South China Sea conflict, about the need for creating a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific region, and as well as the viability of the quadrilateral or the Quad as a stabilizing force in the Indo-Pacific region. While these were issues of mutual concern, there are other developments which has caused alarm for the Indian government when it comes to the foreign policy choices made by the US government. One such area is the sanctions regime which has been imposed on Russia under the CATSA legislation. CATSA stands for Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. This is a legislation which has been passed by the US Congress, and it is designed to impose economic sanctions on the Russian government and few select Russian officials who have been accused by the US for instigating conflicts in Ukraine and in Syria. So the CAATSA legislation targets three American adversaries. One is Russia, then Iran, and as well as North Korea. Essentially, three countries which are hostile towards the United States. So through this legislation, the US Congress plans on imposing economic sanctions on the Russian government. That is, primary sanctions are targeted at the Russian government and its officials. But the same legislation imposes secondary sanctions on countries which are importing weapons from Russia. It is this provision of CAATSA that India is worried about. Because India is looking to import the S-400 anti-aircraft missiles. It's also called as the Triumph missiles. These are state-of-the-art air defense platforms which can be a crucial force multiplier for the Indian armed forces. The S-400 is a highly regarded air defense system, and India is about to finalize the agreement. But such an agreement between India and Russia will impose secondary sanctions on India under the CAATSA legislation. So over the last few months, India has been requesting for a specific waiver for importing the S-400 from Russia to India. Because under CAATSA, there is a provision where the US President can grant a waiver for specific countries. So India is expecting the US to grant a presidential waiver which will basically shield India from sanctions being imposed under the CAATSA. Because India has a legacy relationship with Russia. Russia has been an all-weather friend for India, especially in the defense domain. Most of India's defense systems are imported from Russia. India's defense posture is directly tied to our relations with the Russian government. So the US on one side wants a strong Indian presence in the Indian Ocean region. And for this to happen, India should have access to the latest weapons and defense platforms. And if US expects India to stand up to China, it is very essential that Indian armed forces are well equipped with advanced platforms such as the S-400. So based on this argument, India is seeking a presidential waiver which will shield the S-400 deal from the CAATSA sanctions. But as of now, the US government has said that there is a possibility that India might be exempted under the CAATSA. The exemption might be a one-time exemption only for the import of S-400 missiles. But there is nothing concrete that the US has promised. There is no final commitment that the US government has made with regard to India's concerns about the sanctions imposed on the Russian government. India also has similar concerns with regard to sanctions which have been imposed on Iran. Iran's nuclear program has always been a target of the US government. The US is concerned about Iran's nuclear weapons program. And the crisis between US and Iran was resolved for a short period of time by signing the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The JCPOA agreement was signed between the P5+1 countries and Iran. This had brought the nuclear crisis to an end, and the US had removed the sanctions which were imposed on Iran. But recently, just a few months back, Donald Trump has withdrawn the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The other countries belonging to P5+1, that includes UK, France, China, Russia, and even Germany. These countries have expressed displeasure at the withdrawal of the US government from the crucial nuclear deal agreement with Iran. So since then, US has threatened Iran with sanctions. It has demanded that every country which has a close trade relationship with Iran should scale down the trading relations so that the Iranian nuclear program can be crippled. And Iran's biggest export is definitely oil. Iran is one of the largest oil producing countries. It generates very huge revenue for the Iranian government, a part of which is used to sponsor the nuclear weapons program. So the US government has issued a deadline of 4th November by which all countries which are importing oil from Iran should scale down their oil imports to zero. Basically, they have to put a stop to oil imports from Iran. But this demand of US is highly unreasonable as far as India is concerned. Because India is largely a oil importing country and Iran is the third largest supplier of oil for India. After Iraq and Saudi Arabia, Iran is the third largest oil supplier for India. India's energy security is directly tied to our relations with Iran. So if US sanctions are brought in place and if US threatens India with sanctions, it will put India in a very difficult position because India's energy security is a core part of our national interests. India cannot compromise its energy security just for the sake of US geopolitical interests. India has clearly expressed its displeasure. It has said that it would require time to scale down the imports because this is a situation which has happened a few years before. Before the nuclear deal was signed, US had imposed sanctions on Iran. During that period as well, India was under pressure from US to reduce oil imports. India had slowly reduced the imports to an extent, but it continued to create a parallel mechanism through which Iranian oil could reach India. Essentially, India had tried to balance its relations between US and Iran. Both are equally important, both are strategic partners for India. In order to please the US, we reduced the scale of imports to an extent. And in order to keep Iran in our good books, we continued our trading relationship through a parallel mechanism. Because see, Iran is not just an oil exporting country for us. Iran is a strategic partner for India. Because Iran borders Pakistan and Afghanistan, two countries of great concern and interest for India. India's security relationship with Iran will definitely help in monitoring the situation and to influence the developments in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. Plus, India has invested in developing the Chabahar port, the strategic Chabahar port of Iran, which provides us connectivity to Afghanistan and Central Asian countries. Recently, the Chabahar port has been made operational as well. India has invested millions of dollars. So India cannot afford to risk these investments because our relationship with Iran is a strategic relationship. It goes beyond the question of energy security. So India has expressed these concerns to the US. It has requested US to be reasonable when it comes to sanctions on Iran. It has requested US for an exemption for India, and maybe India in return will scale down the level of imports, but it will continue to have a strategic engagement with Iran. And then India and US have also discussed the ongoing trade disputes. This includes the trade wars which has been triggered by the Trump administration. Donald Trump, who has declared America first as a part of his presidential campaign, is seen to be targeting countries which have those countries which have a trade surplus with the United States. The Trump government believes that other countries are being unfair when it comes to the trade relationship, and as a result, the US has a huge trade deficit with countries like India and China. So the US government has imposed import tariffs or taxes on specific items which are imported from these countries. From India, bikes, steel, aluminium, etc. have been targeted by the US government. Similar tariffs have been imposed on China as well. And these trade wars has actually escalated, and US has even targeted Turkey and a few European countries as well. So these barriers to trade that the US government is creating is actually affecting the trading relationship between India and US. Right now, the volume of trade between India and US stands at around, the volume of trade between India and US is approximately around $126 billion. And India has a very huge surplus in this regard, which means India exports more products to the US than it imports from the United States. So to counter this, the US government has imposed tariffs on few select products which are exported from India. So India has brought out these concerns, which is actually affecting the economic relationship between India and US, because these trade conflicts can further escalate and it can threaten the global economic order. In fact, this is one of the primary reasons behind the massive depreciation that we have seen in the Indian rupee. Due to the trade wars initiated by the US government, US dollars are being removed from emerging economies and it is being reinvested in the United States. Because there are higher interest rates available in the US today, and as a result, foreign currency is fleeing the emerging economies. This is the primary reason behind the massive depreciation in the value of the Indian rupee. So India is worried about a larger destabilization of the economy, which is triggered by American foreign policy choices. So India has brought up these concerns. India has said issues of trade deficit can be addressed as long as both the sides are abiding by the WTO norms. India always respects the multilateral trade regime which was brought out by WTO, and the US is consistently acting against the norms of WTO. This is what India is concerned about. We can see a similar trend with regard to US policy on India's IPR regime or intellectual property rights and the IPR law that India has brought out. India has ensured that our IPR law is in synchronization with the WTO TRIPS arrangement. This is the global standard for IP laws, and India's IP law has been synchronized with WTO TRIPS. But US still has concerns about India's IPR regime, especially with regard to the topic of compulsory licensing. The US believes that India issues compulsory licenses to its pharmaceutical firms to manufacture patented drugs. And US believes that this is at the disadvantage of American pharmaceutical companies which hold patents on these drugs. But India's claim is that we issue compulsory license only as per the provisions of WTO. WTO provides for compulsory licensing in case of a national health emergency. If there is a national health emergency, the government of India can issue a compulsory license and it can order a private sector company in India to manufacture patented drugs. Essentially, generic drugs can be brought out even though there is a patent held by a Western company. So the US government is concerned that American companies are losing out on this regard, and the US Trade Representative or USTR has frequently targeted India on its IPR laws. So these are the concerns that India has brought out, and it has requested US to address these trade conflicts. Because these conflicts in the area of trade and commerce can escalate and it can affect the strategic relationship between India and United States. Then finally, both India and US have spoken about the need for India's entry into the nuclear suppliers group, which is basically an export control regime which tries to prevent nuclear proliferation. It provides for trade in nuclear technology and nuclear raw materials. And India is eagerly waiting to be a part of this elite club so that India can use the platform to engage in nuclear commerce with other countries. This would be very crucial for India's civilian nuclear program, and it will give India access to nuclear raw materials and technology from other countries. It will also enable India to export nuclear technology to other countries as well. But few countries have blocked India's entry into NSG, largely because India has not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty or NPT. And signing NPT is a prerequisite to become a member of NSG. But India has been granted an exemption here by the United States because India will never sign the NPT, as India considers the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a discriminatory treaty, because it will not permit India to develop and possess nuclear weapons, while at the same time it permits the P5 members of the Security Council to possess their nuclear weapons. That includes US, Russia, China, UK and France. Only these 5 countries are recognized as nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and every other country is supposed to give up its pursuit of nuclear weapons. So for this reason, India considers NPT as a discriminatory arrangement, and India has resisted from signing the NPT arrangement. But despite this, the US gave India an exemption through the historic Indo-US nuclear deal, which was signed in 2005. US gave this exemption and it promised to support India to ensure that it enters the 4 important export control regimes. This includes the NSG, the MTCR, Australia Group, and the Wassenaar arrangement. These are the 4 export control regimes which India was looking to become a member of. Over the last few years, India has lobbied with most countries and it has successfully managed to become a member of MTCR, Australia Group and Wassenaar arrangement. Right now, NSG is the only group which has kept India away, mainly because of concerns with regard to non-proliferation. And few countries, especially China, is looking to block India's entry into NSG. And this is the reason why India is seeking greater support from the US to lobby on its behalf and ensure that the NSG members will vote in favor of India. So this issue was also brought up at the 2+2 dialogue, and the US government has expressed complete support to India's entry into the nuclear suppliers group. So in conclusion, the 2+2 dialogue was very fruitful for both India and United States. Crucial agreements have been signed in the area of defense and security. Critical issues of mutual concern have been discussed. India has expressed its concerns with regard to sanctions on Russia, sanctions on Iran, and also has brought up the trade disputes. So the 2+2 format has opened up new possibilities for both India and US to align their defense and strategic policy. It will definitely be helpful for both the sides. It is a win-win situation for both the sides. But there are many concerns which have to be addressed, especially by the United States. If the 2 largest democracies of the world, if they can function together, if they can align their defense and foreign policy objectives, it will definitely bring greater good for the world at large. It will help to stabilize the Indian Ocean region. It will definitely help India to assert itself against China's aggression, and it will create a more level playing field where India can work with other like-minded countries like Japan, Singapore, Australia with assistance from the US, and these countries can create a rules-based order for the Indo-Pacific region. These possibilities definitely exist. In fact, India and US can position themselves as the two key pillars of a rules-based world order. But at the same time, India should remember its time-tested policy of strategic autonomy. It should never abandon the principle of strategic autonomy in its foreign policy. It should never be seen as an ally of a much bigger power, and it should exercise caution before entering into power blocks such as the quadrilateral. India should weigh its options. It should definitely pursue friendly, peaceful relations with China. It should not instigate China unnecessarily by being part of a power bloc which has military ambitions. India should not abandon a time-tested friend such as Russia, which is a crucial partner for India's defense platforms. India should carefully calibrate a foreign policy approach which will balance the relations between US, Russia and China. So going forward, we should watch out whether India will be able to deliver on its commitments, whether US will be able to address India's concerns, whether US will respect India's core national interests. If both the sides manage to address these issues, then definitely the relationship will flourish further and the 2+2 dialogue would become the primary platform through which India and US can achieve strategic alignment of their defense and foreign policy. So this topic can be very important for both UPSC prelims and UPSC mains. In prelims, you can expect factual questions on the foundational agreements that we have discussed. You can expect basic questions on the defense platforms that we have been mentioning. And in mains, UPSC can ask you to evaluate the relationship between India and US and its impact on India's ties with Russia and China. You can get a question on India's role in the Indo-Pacific, on India's role in the quadrilateral, and also on the feasibility of India's alignment with US to counter China. These could be the possible areas of questions for your UPSC exams. With this, I would like to conclude the topic. For more such videos on current developments, kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel and as well as our Facebook page. Thanks for watching.